Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Ashley Abdullah, and I'm the Director of Marketing for Emerge Americas. On behalf of my entire team, we thank you for joining this afternoon's virtual panel entitled Closing the Gap, Driving Diversity and Inclusion in Venture Capital. The majority of our virtual panel will be focused on our presenters today. We'll have the opportunity to engage with them in a dialogue, and we'll be hearing from each of them this afternoon. So we encourage you to get involved in the conversation. If any of the panelists throw out questions or make a statement that particularly resonate with you, I'd like to invite you to submit your comments or questions in the chat box below. If you'd like to submit a particular question for one of our panelists, the best thing to do is use the @ symbol and type the panelist's name. Note that we are recording today's session so as to stream to a larger audience. Therefore, please be sure to keep yourselves on mute so as not to cause a distraction during today's conversation. To open our event, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Consul General Susan Harper.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm Susan Harper, the Consul General for Canada based in Miami. And our Consulate General is one of 16 consulates and trade offices in addition to our embassy in Washington, which work to promote business relations between Canada and the United States. I think it's a very important subject that we are covering today, and it is great to be able to get out a strong message to the right audience, like the one we have today. And I'd like very much congratulate the organizers who have really brought in a good number of participants today. A special thanks to today's sponsors who, along with us, are bringing you this message: Emerge Americas, the Canadian Venture Capital and Private Equity Association, the Minority Business Development Agency Export Center, and the Florida Venture Forum. Together, we have brought together these panelists and these participants in order to promote this important discussion. It's an important discussion because even here in the face of COVID-19, markets are growing, and venture capital is no exception. Our panelists today will discuss practical and actionable recommendations that venture capital firms could take to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion in their portfolio companies, deal flow, and as well as internally. We like to say that venture capital is funding the future, and the future must be more diversified and more inclusive. It's not just the right thing to do. I can tell you as a career trade person, what I have seen is it is good business as well. Our government is very committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have a Minister of Diversity and Inclusion whose mandate includes a long list of actions to ensure that underrepresented communities have equal access to job opportunities, programs, and fundings, among other elements. Her mandate is also specifically referring to racialized and Black communities, LGBTQ2 communities, and importantly, our Indigenous communities. The minister's work complements that of the Minister for Women and Gender Equality, supporting our government's efforts in trying to remedy underrepresentation. This guides our work here in Florida and throughout the United States, connecting with stakeholders like you today and sharing best practices and learning about success stories, both in the US and Canada. It's not just a domestic priority for us, it's also an international priority for us. I have spoken to many groups about the USMCA, especially since it took effect as of July 1st, Canada Day this year. And one of the elements that people have expressed a lot of interest in is that it is a more inclusive agreement. It has aspects for small and medium-sized businesses and underrepresented groups. And I encourage you to look into the opportunities that this new free trade agreement will offer you to do business. As I said, for us, this is not just the good thing to do, the right thing to do. This is good business. And we'd like to talk to you more about both of those aspects. If you have any questions, we have a trade commissioner team here in our office in Miami who would be glad to make introductions and answer your questions. So if I may now, I'd like to turn this over to your moderator for this afternoon, the CEO of eMerge Americas, Felice Gorardo, who will introduce our speakers for today from both Canada and Florida. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Consul General Harper. It's truly an honor to partner with the Consulate of Canada in Miami. And I want to also acknowledge and thank the Trade Commissioner, Matthew Waldron, for creating the space for today's virtual event. If I can also take a personal point of privilege, it's an honor to be able to partner with Canada. My family is actually originally from Cuba. And when we were fleeing, our family was fleeing the Cuban Revolution, it was because of Canada that my mother's family was first able to get out. My grandfather worked for the Royal Bank of Canada, and it was through those relationships that they were able to come here to the US. So for that, I'm very appreciative, and it's an honor to be able to moderate today's discussion. I want to welcome everyone in the audience to this afternoon's virtual panel. As the Consul General said, my name is Felice Gorardo, and I'm CEO of eMerge Americas, a platform that connects the dots between startups, investors, higher ed, corporate enterprises, and government officials like the government of Canada, all with one objective: to spur investment and innovation across the Americas, and to help create a sustainable and thriving tech hub for the Americas here in South Florida. To this end, each year we host an annual global tech event at the Miami Beach Convention Center, which convenes more than 16,000 attendees from over 40 countries. In and outside of that event, we create and curate content and resources for entrepreneurs, investors, and our entire ecosystem to help address the latest challenges and opportunities in tech and in venture. And that's why today's conversation couldn't be more timely and more important. For the last several months, we've been battling with an unprecedented trifecta of a health, economic, and social crisis. The horrific and senseless murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and many more have truly challenged all of us to take a hard look at the lack of equity in our society and the systemic barriers to opportunities. Many companies have had to do a lot of soul searching through this difficult conversations and have realized that there is much more work to be done, specifically to try and develop and foster diverse, inclusive, and representative ecosystems. And VCs have an important role to play in this space because venture capital is funding the future. The decisions made by VCs can shape and reshape systems and can seed and scale tech that makes our world go round, like Google, Facebook, Uber, just to name a few. Yet the venture capital space is still lagging behind across the board when it comes to greater diversity and inclusion. While we still have ways to go, the business case for greater diversity and inclusion within the workforce is pretty well established. And yet research by leading consulting firms, McKinsey and BCG, show that more diverse teams perform better than their more homogeneous counterparts. And they create businesses that are more relevant to their target markets and target customers. They create more shareholder and stakeholder value, as well as generate more wealth and on-ramps for opportunity for underrepresented entrepreneurs and communities of color. Even though many funds now understand that diversity and inclusion are essential to their success, many still don't know where to start. And that's the objective of our conversation today. It's to discuss practical and actionable recommendations VC firms can take to promote diversity and inclusion in their portfolio companies, in deal flow, and in their management teams. So without further ado, it's my honor and privilege to introduce our panelists who are going to be joining us this afternoon. Please join me in welcoming Sophie Gupta. Sophie is a general partner and principal of Yaletown Partners, a leading Canadian IoT and clean tech investor focusing on intelligent industry companies. Sophie is also the co-founder and board member of the Equality Fund, which was awarded a $300 million Partnership for Gender Equality Award from the Government of Canada in 2019. Additionally, Sophie co-chairs the Diversity and Inclusion Committee of the Canadian Venture Capital and Private Equity Association. Thank you for being with us, Sophie. Also joining us this afternoon is Anya Klimbowska. Anya is the CEO and co-founder of Diversio, a technology company that leverages data to analyze, improve, and track diversity and inclusion in the workplace. Diversio works with companies in 30 different countries, and she was formerly Director of Research for the Office and the CEO of the Royal Bank of Canada, where she led Royal Bank of Canada's thought leadership on the future of work and developed RBC Upskill, a digital tool helping Canadians build resiliency in an age of AI and workplace automation. And as an advisor for the Pan-Canadian K-12 Computer Science Education Framework, a joint initiative between Canada Learning Code, Amazon, and the Government of Canada. Thanks for joining us, Anya. Our next guest is a friend and a close partner of Emerge Americas. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Susan Amat. She is the president and founder of Venture Hive, a Miami-based organization focused on democratizing entrepreneurship education through a global network of accelerators, universities, and K-12 programs. Dr. Amat served as the founding chair of the STEM board for Miami-Dade County Public Schools and actively speaks about entrepreneurship education internationally. She has consulted with the U.S. Department of State, the Kauffman Foundation, and the World Bank on ecosystem development. And in 2012, Dr. Amat was also honored as a champion of change at the White House. Welcome, Susan, and thank you for joining us today. And last but not least is another dear friend and longtime partner of Emerge Americas, Leanne Buchanan. Leanne is the founding executive director of Venture Cafe Miami and has led the organization to exponential growth and impact by connecting more than 50,000 innovators and establishing more than 1,000 content partnerships with national and global organizations. Leanne is a writer, a facilitator, a frequent speaker on strategies for inclusive innovation and building equitable entrepreneurial ecosystems. She's worked with technology and innovation leaders at Fortune 500 companies, including Google, Facebook, P&G Ventures, Airbnb, and HSBC. Previously, she was a legal counsel to entrepreneurs, startups, and multinational corporations. And as a fun fact, she's a native of Canada. Welcome, Leanne. It's great to have you with us today.
Thank you.
So we have a limited amount of time, so we're going to jump right in. Sophie, the first question is for you. The Canadian Venture Capital Association has a diversity and inclusion mandate, which seeks to provide tools to member companies with the goal of increasing the number of women and other underrepresented groups in private capital industry. The results from the association's 2019 report, in addition to the data uncovered in Where's the Dow Now and Women in Venture reports, clearly show that the need to increase representation of women in senior ranks of private capital investment firms. But from your perspective, what specific areas of opportunity exist to ensure there is a more diverse pipeline of candidates?
Thanks, Felice. You're right. So the CVCA, in partnership with BDC and Deloitte, published an interesting report last year, and there have been similar and a couple of other reports published by trade associations. I know in the United States as well as in Europe, and by and large, the numbers are pretty much the same across the board. If I'm speaking within the Canadian context, we're talking about 11% of decision makers in Canadian BCs as women, which is pretty shocking. And one of the first sort of questions or points that have raised is that it is, as you suggest, a pipeline issue, and that perhaps there just simply aren't enough women candidates for the role. We know it's important for all the reasons you laid out in your intro, and not the least of which is that there's enough support or enough data to support that having at least one woman in a decision-making role at a VC firm leads to improved performance and a high level of improved performance. But really, if we're talking about wanting to make meaningful systemic change, as you say, it's not enough to just consider the candidates at senior levels, but we really kind of have to look across the value chain. We have to look at the entirety of the root causes. So the report itself looked not only at senior roles, but also at mid-level managers, so non-partner principals and beyond, as well as entry-level and junior levels. And while there's certainly room for improvement, that goes without saying, it isn't quite as bleak as I think the senior levels lead to lead to suggest. So going back to that idea of looking across the value chain, we really need to consider, well, what are the profile of students coming out of universities? What is the access to hiring talent pools? What are the retention policies that firms are considering? What are the opportunities for mentoring for women within firms? And how do we shift the culture more broadly? I said it was a bit of a fallacy. If you look at college graduates, 57% of them are women. If you look at more specifically which organizations or which programs tend to lead themselves to a career in venture, you have 50% of CPAs that are women. You have 47% of law students that are women, 48% of business students, and now increasingly more and more. I think we're at up to about 40% of MBA classes. So what can we do, right? That was the question. I think we can educate firms on the importance of work structure and flexibility in how to attract a gender diverse workforce. Appointing a D&I champion in-house in the firm themselves. This needs to be a senior person, someone who can speak up when decisions are being made and raise their hand if those decisions are not being inclusive. We can look to the HR policies. So parental leave, flexible working. You said it yourself, right? If anything, the past 6 months have shown us just how valuable that is, especially when we understand that the burden of family responsibilities disproportionately fall on women. Getting into the opportunities for retention. How are we fostering an inclusive culture? What training opportunities are there for employees to help understand their own biases and appreciation for intersectionality? What sort of support do firms have for women within the organizations for prayer, for lactation rooms and beyond? And I think a lot of the work that the CBCA Diversity and Inclusion Committee is centered on that. So speaking to university students, doing reach outs, ask me anything, being the voice, showcasing our success stories, and then the accountability piece. So measuring, tracking, reporting, and using that as a benchmark.
Thank you, Sophie. Some great points here, especially the idea of looking at the entire value chain and the entirety of the root causes, and very practical ones too, with regards to having a high-level D&I champion and accountability metrics. Would you say, are there any VCs in particular that come to mind that you would think are getting this right, and best practices that can be employed?
So, I mean, there are a number of different ways that I think VC firms can really help to shape the future through their funding decisions, right? You said it very eloquently yourself, capital means influence. I think the industry as a whole has a responsibility to positively influence society that we're investing in. We're shaping the future. And there are a number of different ways that we can do that. With the firm itself, we just talked about a couple of those ways, looking at our portfolio companies themselves. So how do you expand your deal flow? How do you go beyond traditional sources? There's an organization in the United Kingdom called Upfront Ventures that's recently launched what they're calling the Upfront Inclusion Clause. It's a non-binding clause. They've open sourced the language that they're including in their term sheets, which basically asks their portfolio companies to include an inclusion rule such that at least one woman and or a member of a population that's currently underrepresented in that organization be formally interviewed for every open executive position. And funds are doing things in various different ways. They're including explicit clauses in their term sheets requiring companies to include or adopt a diversity and inclusion policy within 6 months of an investment, or they're just encouraging the conversation around the board table. At an ecosystem level, I think that there are a number of funds doing really interesting work as well. To cite a couple of American VC groups, they've recently launched something called the Diversity Fighter, which is basically a group of 9 very influential American VCs that got together and said that they wanted to design an initiative to evolve the way that venture investing is done, to bring in Black and other represented groups, including women, into the co-investment opportunity on deals. So creating diversity at the core of the deal-making this helps emerging managers get to the table, be recognized as brand names, check writers, especially at the early stages, proves their track record. So there are a number of different initiatives like this that I think, I don't know that there's one fund that's doing it perfectly, but we're all, I think, working together, and it's the idea of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee as a safe space to come together, brainstorm open source ideas, and work on how do we move the needle, how do we move the dial incrementally.
Thank you, Sophie. And I see there's a question coming in from someone on the chat. What is the VC again? I think it was maybe in reference to the 9 influential VCs that have come out in support of the diversity rider. And the person saying, yes, that's it. We will circulate. There's a good article, I think, in TechCrunch, another one. In Fortune, we can circulate on more background on that, but we'll also follow up after today's panel. Susan, from your perspective, what are some of the unique systemic barriers that you've observed that entrepreneurs have encountered in South Florida and in other ecosystems you've operated in? And how have you seen more successful entrepreneurs overcome them?
So I really appreciated Sophie's overview of what's happening. I thought that was such a great way to start. And the fact that you transitioned from kind of what a lot of people think of in diversity, which is just having more female representation. And there's such good data on female representation in VC, a lot in angel. All of those conversations are really interesting. But I want to make sure we're thinking about the much wider underrepresented community aspect too, which you touched upon at the end. When I think about the entrepreneurs we work with, so much of the challenge comes through when a VC starts looking at you and doing diligence, even at the seed stage. If you haven't had angels or other people to kind of reinforce or give you access to that network or do a stamp of approval that you're real and that you know how to spend money and document where it's going and that you can actually follow through on things, you kind of don't have access to that next level. And so especially when I look at female founders, we're working, because of my role in the Global Entrepreneurship Network, we work with entrepreneurs all over the world. And when you start seeing the challenges where companies are scaling really well, but they may have had a local angel, typically somebody who made their money from a family business, who may not give them the right resources or support or access to network that so many of us in the US and Canada are able to access because of our networks, to be able to kind of do that seal of approval, it's a major barrier. So when I think about real diversity for VC firms, whether they're in the US or Canada or elsewhere in the globe, that larger diversity piece really comes through. Understanding emerging markets, education level, experience level, color, all of those things really make a difference in making sure you have somebody who can advocate for you as to why they should give you an opportunity to do that formal pitch, move forward with that fund, because they may not get that you may not have been exposed to these things in the past, or you may need a little extra coaching with a few certain areas because it's just not something that can happen in your region, or because of your background, you may not have had access to that mentoring or type of support before. So it's a much bigger challenge. And with entrepreneurs, whether they're from South Florida, some of the wonderful Canadian entrepreneurs we work with as well, a lot of times they're coming from a different region, looking at a market entry, whether it's into Canada or into the US, vice versa. And sometimes it's just basic cultural things where they do need that person vouching for them, who can give them a little extra coaching on being direct, how they're communicating certain bits of information, collecting data in a way that's going to be more in line with what a traditional VC may be looking for, as opposed to what their angel or other investors, board members may have been looking for in the past. So a lot of times it's really a focus on the professionalism of a team that might be killing it, hustling, doing really well, great revenue, great growth, but they may just not have the data as easily readily available to kind of tell the story from how a VC may be very used to receiving, here's our growth and here's what we're doing. with some of the entrepreneurs we work with from different countries coming into a US market entry situation, so they become South Florida entrepreneurs. How do I put this? Some are much more comfortable being aggressive than others. Sometimes the culture of being a little bit more humble and not bragging about what they're doing and how it looks is something that they have to learn before they're able to really make sure that they can compete with companies that are super comfortable bragging about what they do when there may not be anything there. So it's really just about level setting and making sure that entrepreneurs go into these situations knowing that what might be appropriate to one VC may be very inappropriate or just have an immediate pass, because some people, and many of the female VCs that I've had the pleasure of knowing over many years, they want real, authentic, here's what we're good at, here's what we don't want. And I think I can say that for most men too, but I do see a lot of investing in people who are just super good at pitching and the substance is not always as strong. So hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you, Susan. Some very practical feedback there. And yeah, I think to pivot back to something that Sophie touched on with regards to accountability. Anya, your Diversio has published a lot of data and insights on how companies can deliver on diversity and inclusion benchmarks. Can you tell us a little bit how Diversio helps companies evaluate areas of improvement, and more importantly, how these changes can be sustained?
Yeah, absolutely. It's my pleasure. So we are a technology company, and as such, we actually have a dashboard solution to help organizations both analyze, improve, and track diversity and inclusion internally. The way that we do this is by collecting data from employees and essentially generating heat maps that indicate whether or not there's any areas of systemic bias, discrimination, barriers to advancement at a very granular level, maybe by department or by office or region, et cetera, occurring in the company. And then once we use the analytics to unlock and uncover those insights, we have, in effect, matching technology, so AI algorithms that we run to generate very custom action plans for our clients. It's interesting and a very relevant part of this conversation, but when we originally relaunched the product a couple of years ago, we really did focus on enterprise and SMEs. We thought that those were the companies and those were the organizations that were under the most pressure and the ones who were the most interested and dedicated to diversity and inclusion. Interestingly now, though, we're not only working quite a lot with smaller companies, so much earlier stage companies, but we're doing a lot of work with investors as well. So we're actually in the middle of an international global initiative with investors in Canada, in the UK, and the US. It's actually expanded now. We're also including investors from Europe and more broadly, we have one in Singapore. And the idea with them is that they're actually adopting a 3-stage process for diversity and inclusion and advancing diversity and inclusion. The first step is an assessment of their own programs and policies, both from an internal, what are we doing to make sure that we're diverse and we're representative of the population that we are invested in, that we serve perspective, but then also from an external, what are we doing to promote diversity and inclusion in our portfolio companies? The second stage of this process is investors actually deploying our technology with themselves. So assessing their own culture, understanding, are we fully empowering our women investors, for example? Or are we, looking at other types of diversity on the team, like LGBTQ or people of color, definitely intersectionality for the larger investors there as well. And then the last stage, which a lot of investors are actually at this third stage now, is actually them going out and deploying these surveys with their portfolio companies. So asking the founders of their portfolio companies to share the data collection with their employees. And then what they receive is in effect a dashboard that shows them Number one, are any of their companies performing quite well, which is it something that they can then take back to their shareholders, their clients, their customers, their LPs, because people care about this very deeply. And then number two, are any of their companies struggling? Are any of their companies vulnerable to something like toxic culture or racism or even a Me Too? And then for the companies that are struggling, they really get in there and they tactically start implementing programs and policies to assist those companies and level them up. So it really is this end-to-end kind of cycle of tracking and understanding what is the baseline, and then setting goals not only for representation, not only for diversity, but also for inclusion. Because at the end of the day, you might get that talent through the door, but if there's systemic bias that's experienced by people of color on a daily basis, you're just not going to that's not the point. You're not going to empower that group of people to contribute and to be part of the workforce that you ultimately want them to. So yeah, really, really exciting initiative. We're actually in the process of having this last stage, so the portfolio assessment stage, endorsed by the UK Treasury. And yeah, lots of Canadian VCs participating as well. So BDC, Omer's Ventures, McCraw Capital. In the States, we actually had Bessemer just came on, which is really exciting, and lots of others also. So really great work, and clearly these firms are dedicated.
Thank you so much, Anya. And yeah, I think tying it to a question that's in the chat right now, and I think also kind of dovetails off of what Susan shared with us. One of the questions is, how can we fight microaggressions in the space? And just given your insight and your experience with Diversio, anything practical in terms of what you've seen implemented to help fight this in almost a systemic or scalable way?
So there's two things that I've seen. There's two things that I've seen work. One is, it's an oldie but a goodie, I guess. We are seeing the emergence of new types of training that are quite effective. So at the end of the day, it's not that exciting, but it can be very effective. The second one is more not interesting, but it's a little bit more innovative. We're actually testing it right now, beta testing it. We've developed a tool that is separate from our core technology. Basically, it plugs into organization Slack or internal messaging platform, and it goes through public channels and totally anonymous, fully aggregated. It basically boils up insights on the patterns of communications between employees, and then we play those back to the employees. So, for example, if we're looking at the communications between men versus women, we're looking at patterns. So those patterns could be anything from NLP on that sentiment of messages being sent, to even something as basic as how long does it take for someone to reply to someone else on average. So, if men are waiting like 10 minutes and women are waiting 2 hours, then that's a systemic kind of bias or unconscious barrier that is manifesting. We can spot microaggressions with this as well through the sentiment analysis. And what we're finding is by playing back these aggregated insights to employees, you're really able to change behavior, because you're able to show to employees their own unconscious biases. And no one is immune to that. Everyone has unconscious biases, but without, you don't put employees on the defensive, or you don't put individuals on the defensive. You literally just let them know this is the pattern of behavior that's occurring in the organization. And it makes people more mindful about their day-to-day interactions, or just how they're engaging with their colleagues. And we're seeing that this has quite a good strong impact as well.
Oh, very cool. If you have that link and you can put it in the chat for that Slack plugin, I know that's something I think a lot of us would love to.
Yeah, totally. We're actually coming out with a new website at the end of the week, so stay tuned. And it will have that will be highlighted on the website. But yeah, happy to share more if anyone wants to get in touch.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Anya. We'll definitely stay tuned to that. Leanne, you recently penned an op-ed for the Miami Herald in which you explained how racial indifference is endemic to our society. But you shared also, I think, an insightful point of view, and specifically that we can innovate our cultural context towards racial equity. What did you mean by that, and what actionable steps can leaders in the innovation space take to do just that?
Awesome. Well, thanks, Felice. It's a good question. I always wonder what I think about the things that I write, but I do have an actual framework and a point, and it's been tested through Venture Cafe. So for those that don't know, I know you mentioned at the outset, over the last 4 years, we've been able to connect the ecosystem in South Florida, Miami being the hotspot, but we've seen folks from all across the region. And what I appreciate most about what we've done intentionally, and there's a framework that I want to share really quickly about how we can innovate for inclusion, diversity, equity, and access, is that the data, and I know Susan's a big fan of actually looking at underlying data. When we look at who's coming, we see that 70% of people are people of color. Now, Miami is a majority minority city, so that doesn't seem that great, but we overrepresent in the groups that are traditionally underrepresented and overlooked or marginalized. So we see about 28% of Black African American, we see about 9% Asian, which is not as common for the demographic and the makeup in Miami, and we see a really interesting split. Around 49% of people that are participating in Venture Cafe programming and convening are women. And so that is not what you would typically see at a startup or innovation focused program. And that also extends to the side of presenters versus attendees, similar metrics. And what I want to say is that's not by accident. I think a lot of times, I think to Anya's point, we think about creating innovative spaces, but we don't think about creating inclusive innovative spaces. And that requires us to think about innovation, not just a tool that is leveraged by technology, but something that is cultural. And so when you create a culture around inclusive innovation, you need to look at several indicators of how you can design for equity. This framework that I like to call the innovation currency model looks at different forms of capital. So when we're looking at building ecosystems very intentionally, oftentimes we'll think about the institutions being the drivers of what we do to create economic development and entrepreneurial ecosystem strategy. So we'll look for the academic institutions, government, the conveners, the ESOs. But this model thinks about how we start from the ground up and more of a grassroots approach, understanding that the lived experiences of the entrepreneurs are the expertise that we need to design for and build around. And so looking at 6 primary forms of capital and beginning to develop the benchmarks where you measure against the experiences and the indicators of those forms of capital are important. So obviously, when we think about capital, we think about financial capital. That is the number one thing that people think about: access to capital, equity-based investments. But when we look at financial capital, the right approach is to understand how accessible is it to the broadest cross-section of the community. And that allows for you to look at those innovative approaches like Sophie mentioned that a lot of VCs are doing. Dave Chittister at Seed said, we don't see a lot of Black founders. What is the root cause? Well, Black founders may not have the same access to capital and generationally because of racial wealth gaps and other institutionalized forms of racism. So let me create a fund that gives us friends and family rounds. So that is beginning to look at how you create access to capital, but within the context of the societal parameters. Other forms of capital that you think about in inclusive innovation ecosystem building is social capital. So looking at how we create connectivity for reciprocal high value relationships becoming more accessible to more people. Capacity is important. Not just lockstep programs to do a one-size-fits-all approach to entrepreneurship. And I know Susan knows this really well with the work that she's been doing globally, is you need to look at the needs that individual categories of entrepreneurs may have, rather than saying, here's the solution. If you do this, you will be successful. Creative capital is also really important. It's a mindset piece. And this is where we think about the culture around what are the external pressures environmentally, culturally, individually, as we think about the work of our entrepreneurs in Overtown that limit an individual's capacity to create new ideas. If you can't pay your rent, you don't have the mental space to be able to think about innovative solutions, right? And so looking at those as a factor around ecosystem building is important. And then finally, the other piece is political capital, which you know very well, Felice, working with governments, working with organizations like the Consulate General, with Susan and Matthew and the team there, to begin to understand how influence and power plays a role in your access to opportunities, and what those structures do to prevent or roadblock entrepreneurs and innovators from accessing things that would create opportunities. If you look at SBIR grants, when I go in Overtown and talk to some of the founders, they don't even know that the government has funding available to help them offset the cost of proving out the MVP or value proposition of their business. And then finally, inspiration capital is important, which is this idea that when I think of an entrepreneur or an innovator that's successful, it should not be a white male tech CEO. And that's what I aspire to be, because I don't always, my experience doesn't represent that experience. But when we look at the screen and I see all the faces of women, people of color, people of different ages, different gender identities, when those people are elevated in the narrative and storytelling around an ecosystem where it's not just one singular narrative that represents what innovators can aspire to be like, it creates an external source of motivation, which is really important when we think about creating an environment for innovators to thrive that's inclusive.
And thank you, Leanne. I think also we need to circulate your article so others can dive deeper. You made this as almost kind of a call to action a few months back with this piece, and I wanted to ask both you and Susan. Have you seen a change in mindsets? Have you seen folks actually put their money where their mouth is and follow through on some of these recommendations? What's been your general reaction from, and from your perspective, how things have changed or haven't since then?
Felice, if I may, I apologize first for not saying your name correctly the first time, but also now I'm afraid I've been putting off another call because I found this discussion so interesting, and the chat as well. I've been watching alongside, but I'm very apologetic. I have to go. I know my colleague Matt Waldron, who put this together from our side, continues to listen because we do have a role to play in this. So my apologies for having to leave what is a great discussion, and I see is being recorded so I can hear the end. Thank you for the opportunity to speak and to be on accompanying such a great panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Consul General Harper. Thank you so much.
So Felice, to your question, which is, have we seen change? I think that that question is difficult to answer because we have to get on the same page around what change means. Change means different things to different communities. So I think we've seen a lot of performative allyship happen, which is this effort to check the box, do a diversity training, have something that involves people of color, particularly Black folks, because that is what is front of mind in the national discourse. And I'm optimistic. I think performative allyship is at least a first step, but it's not the step that we actually need to really move the community forward. The Miami Herald recently published a series that focused on the disparities between Black Miami and the rest of Miami, noting that Miami is one of the most segregated cities in America when it comes to the Black experience, which you wouldn't think about because we always say we're diverse because we're a majority minority city. So to answer your question specifically, I'm enthused at the effort. And I'm enthused about the conversations that I'm having behind the scenes with a lot of the ecosystem builders, stakeholders. You and I have had conversations, people that are saying, what can we do and how can we do it together with WinCode's hackathon that Emerge partnered with. However, I want us to understand that you cannot dismantle systemic issues like racism that infiltrate every aspect of an ecosystem without providing an ecosystem solution, which requires collaboration, it requires infrastructure, it requires strategy, and it requires measurement. And so looking at how we can address cultural deficits through an ecosystem and alignment with different stakeholders is where I'd really love to see us go. And that's kind of the work that Venture Cafe is really transitioning to provide better support to do.
Way to set the bar with that answer, Leanne. Okay, so first I want to kind of start off with something simple. A friend of mine was raising her Series B, and she was having all of these awesome meetings. She got meetings with all these amazing partners in the Valley, and her retelling of the example back to me was, it felt like every meeting I had, I was meeting with these very powerful men, and I didn't remind them of their younger selves, where they were talking to somebody that they could mentor and nurture and wanted to give a chance to. I probably ended up reminding them more of their ex-wives. And when you think of it in those kind of terms, that's a joke, guys. It actually happened, but it's a joke. So when you think of it in those terms, when you go back to Leanne's amazing op-ed, it really makes you think about the people who are the decision makers at the table deciding to fund you and not just give you money, but fight for you, network for you, you know, mentor you. Because some of these firms, they're like in there, they're your partners. It's really that disconnect that we have to, at the end of the day, figure out how to overcome, so that you have somebody who has all of those PowerPoints, those status pieces that Leanne referred to, who's then in your court vouching for you to all the other people who don't look like you, sound like you, think like you. And that, I think, is the big missing link. I also want to mention, and I would love to get Sophie's take on this and Anya's take on this from the Canadian perspective. We've been working with a group of amazing, strong, awesome women in the Middle East, and specifically in Saudi. Some of the data we found was amazing, because Saudi angel investors, they have money like VCs everywhere else. They're putting in 5 to 25 million of their own dollars on their own doing angel investing a year. Women have that in their bank accounts too, but it sits there. So one of the things we've been working on as a training and program we're starting in the Middle East in a month is having women unleash all of this capital to other women entrepreneurs, and to help them, because these women are not, you know, they didn't inherit the money. They are very successful business women who just have their money in safe investments because this is a new world to them. So they will be the strong mentors and advocates with all the capital that we've been referring to make those connections happen into government, into whatever corners, especially with B2B, that are needed. So it will be, when I think about what's happening in Miami, we're starting to see that. We're starting to see a lot more women being engaged, either starting female-only funds, being engaged with some of these larger groups. One of our dear friends, Melissa Krinsman, has been like the face of the strongest women in VC that all of us know for many, many years. But that next step of, okay, there are women who are already in the scene who want to now be an investor or be more active in it, cool. But I think the next step is all of these women who are not in the scene, who are not in tech, but have incredible backgrounds, incredible insights, education, who would be like the dream mentors, a lot of times also have money sitting there that's being put into safe investments. How do we have them get invested both with their time and their capital to be that new face of early to then growth stage to really move the needle, getting a lot more diversity at the lower level of early stage capital to then prepare them properly to access VC?
Sophie,
Sorry, so yeah, Sophie, Anya, any thoughts? Sorry, Felice.
no, absolutely.
I think that's such a great point, and we're definitely seeing a lot more of this. So as I mentioned, we're working with VCs on this big international initiative right now, and even one of the funds that I was talking to this morning, they're based in France, and they were saying that over the last decade, there were barely any funds with women partners, and over the last 5 years, they could name 10. So just that exponential expansion of women investors getting into the space, whether it's as angels or whether it's as partners, institutional money, whatever it is, there's definitely that flow. Something interesting that I remembered as you were talking about this was actually, so this is an asset manager that we worked with, a fairly, large and a prominent one based in the States on the West Coast. And when the CEO came to us, he said, listen, you need to get in there because we're losing our clients. And we said, what do you mean you're losing your clients? And he said, well, we had a lot of men managing money or managing our clients, and they were managing men. So these high net worth, wealth individuals for quite some time, and now they're getting older, and they are unfortunately passing away, and their wives aren't staying with us because the partners did not make an effort to connect with the spouse. They did not make an effort to build a relationship, and their wives are leaving. They're taking the money, and they're either going to a woman-friendly asset manager, or they're just kind of taking it into their own hands and figuring it out themselves. And so he said, this is definitely a priority, and I have an internal commitment here, but also this is just like we need to do this because this is something that we're seeing happen on like the other side of things. So I think that there's definitely both ends to the coin. And I know I did not speak to Canada. I spoke to France and the States. But Sophie, maybe you could speak to Canada.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's an incredibly interesting conversation, and I think it touches upon a couple of different points, right? So there's certainly the question around angels and access to how do women or particular groups support that same particular group. So how do Black angel investors support Black founders, or how do women angels support women founders? And there are a number of organizations that exist across Canada, across the States. Up in Canada, there's a group called Female Funders that published a report together with Highline Beta a couple of years ago that draw light on this particular issue. In the US, but it's actually quite international, there's an organization called All Raise, which is really, really quite good at beyond just the angel level, but they have these cohorts of women, these cohort programs, I suppose, that provide women in venture with a curated, supported community of peers. So it provides career guidance, access to deal flow, how to grow as an investor, and you're in a cohort according to your level of experience. So there's an analyst associate one, there's a principal one, there's a partner one. I think you connect every couple of weeks or months. In any case, it's but one example. And then similarly, I mean, we're talking about women, but similarly, I think there are a whole bunch of other typically structured as not-for-profit organizations that are addressing this very same question from a race and ethnic perspective. I was chatting with the CEO of an organization in Canada called Icon Talent Management that's looking at addressing the question of education for Black founders on how to improve upon the pitch decks. How do they speak to the language of the investors? How do they appeal to that human side, but that economic side? And I think that's a really important part of the conversation, but a little bit on what you touched on is how do we bring along the investors on this journey as well? And to really affect systems level change, we're going to have to address it at multiple different entry points. So there's the education of the founders level, there's the education of the investors level, and why partnerships with organizations like a trade association or a not-for-profit, something that's grounded at the grassroots or community-based accelerators have this really unique opportunity to help provide that education, I suppose, and drive the change sort of incrementally.
Absolutely not. Thank you, Sophie. And Leanne, I recognize also I asked you a very South Florida specific question, but your work spans the whole globe, and especially through the Venture Cafe Network. are there any ecosystems in particular that you feel are getting it right or better than others? And specifically to your earlier point, trying to attack this from the ground up.
Oof. So I guess I would say I don't think anybody's getting it right, because there's always room for improvement. And so I think what we do to answer that question is look at elements from different ecosystems and see what works. When you think about ecosystem building, and actually you have to look at what are the challenges on the ground in each market. There's a lot of similar challenges that exist, but they're going to be nuanced, and they're going to relate to the specific assets, opportunities, weaknesses, existing organizations within any market. So elements that I think are really awesome that I'd love to see replicated, our partners in New England. In Rhode Island, for example, they have a lot more state-sponsored or government involvement in supporting different efforts to help entrepreneurs in priority industries and more broadly. So they're one of the main partners in Venture Cafe in Rhode Island. I would say our friends in Boston, particularly around some of the spaces, so the physical spaces. I know COVID has made us think differently about spaces, but something like Innovation Hall, that on average pre-COVID was seeing close to 100,000 visitors a year, able to be a space for convening kind of the living room of an innovation ecosystem where people can connect where they didn't have existing networks. And that is in partnership with Microsoft and the city of Boston. What I love about the ecosystem in Sydney is they have a lot of relationships with a consortium of academic partners. The same thing in Philly with the U City Science Center. So you have academia connected to industry, looking at actually measuring and tracking patents and tech transfer and things of that nature. So I think elements of having academia involved more intentionally and not just as an aside is helpful. And then I also look to ecosystems that may not have a venture cafe that I think are doing some really, really cool things, which is, spaces like Durham, North Carolina, for example, where the founders of the Black Wall Street and American Underground are doing a lot to support Black founders in partnership with Google for Black Founders Exchange and Google for Startups. Things that I see that are really exciting in Atlanta with the Gathering Spot and efforts by larger corporates to really involve in connecting not just social enterprises, but nonprofits and entrepreneurs at various levels with each other, and doing a lot of ecosystem building work with the consortium of larger companies. I think they've got Coca-Cola, Chick-fil-A, Home Depot, and the various foundations. And so I think the goal is, and it's interesting we're having this conversation because simultaneously Kauffman is convening day 3 of eShip, which is kind of the eShip summit. I think the goal is to have a list of strategies or tactics, have assessed and diagnosed what the root cause. I love that Sophia used that. It's my favorite thing to say, what is the underlying why? The root cause of the inequities or the gaps that you see manifested in the ecosystem, and then begin to look at what are the right tactics that you deploy to address those gaps. And then the road mapping requires understanding that you can't do everything all at once. So creating a plan, a time anchored strategy for what are the tactics are we going to do at different points? How are we going to measure it? How are we going to iterate? And then executing a roadmap over multiple years. And it's not something that you fix just like that.
If I can sort of like jump in just to underline boldface exclamation point again, since we're virtual, what Leanne just said, and I think I wanted to share that in my experience, my conversations with other people, very often what I hear is this sense, and I'll speak from the perspective of my fellow GPs, that we come to this conversation with this, okay, I understand, I've got the business case, I get it, this is important, and I need to do it, if for no other reason than for my financial returns to my investors. But it's this pressure to kind of have it all figured out and to do it perfectly. Yeah. And to have the broadest sense of diversity. And so you get tripped up in this definition of what it should be and all the different tools that you could or should have at your disposal. but start small and start realistic, right? Start with one particular lens and work your way up. And I think taking off the pressure to have it perfect, going back to that accountability piece, taking a step internally and saying, where are we at? Okay, what are our goals? What are our value? I loved that roadmap. I mean, that's just exactly what it is. And bringing along your investors and bringing along your portfolio companies and your GP peers, the ecosystem as a whole, on this journey with you is, from my view, the most holistic and organic way of actually approaching this conversation. And it is the one that's the most true to the whole notion of inclusion, frankly.
Amen, amen.
If I can just add to that.
Absolutely.
I'm so sorry. I love the fact that we're hitting upon this. You know, Leanne mentioned how nerdy I was. I know I try to hide it, but very unsuccessfully. We are measurement and evaluation experts. That's what we do. We're doing a project now with the UK government. We're doing one thing in South Florida now, which I cannot share until 2 more weeks. But when you start with a very simple, we want to increase this. It's one variable, and you may have 2 or 3 or 4 levels to it. Simple. Every single time it ends up being this convoluted 80,000 variables that ends up making everyone feeling like they're a guinea pig by the end. When you start looking at not just founding team, but who are your hires and what indirects are you using, and it gets crazy and you lose sight of just the authentic, let's increase this one variable. So Sophie, I'm really happy that you brought it back to that. Let's just focus on moving one step at a time, make it really, really simple. And then when we got that question down, we can add another variable. It's basic experiment design, right? And then it becomes really easy for everybody to say, you know what, we're going to do this and we're going to do it the best and figure that out. And then we can start adding all this other stuff. But it comes down to everybody understanding the definitions, understanding exactly what the role is. We're not here for tokenism. We're here for making sure that we're being as open-minded as possible in whatever variables are the key to what the values and underlying goals are for that fund, that approach, that competition, that whatever it is.
Thank you, Susan. And it was just very pragmatic and actionable advice there. And we'll stay tuned to some news that you'll be sharing with us, I think, in 2 weeks on what you're working on in South Florida. Eager to see that. I can't believe it's been already an hour because our conversation flew by and I thought we were only about 15 minutes in. But with that said, I just wanted to say thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you, Sophie, Anya, Susan, Leanne. I think I speak for everyone when I say this was an incredibly enriching and thought-provoking discussion with actionable takeaways. We greatly appreciate you taking the time and sharing your valuable insights on how we can help make our ecosystems more truly diverse and inclusive for all. But before we close today's program, we do have 2 more special guests with us to share some closing remarks and their reflections on today's discussion. First, I'm going to hand it over to Michelle Scarborough, the Managing Partner for Strategic Investment and Women in Tech from BDC. Please join me in welcoming Michelle.
Felicia, unfortunately, Michelle wasn't able to log in, and I believe Kevin may be saying some comments. If we could add Kevin over just a moment.
Sounds great, absolutely.
There we go.
And now we'll hand it over to our final speaker, Kevin Bouillon, President and CEO of the Florida Venture Forum. Please join me in welcoming Kevin. Kevin, I think you're still on mute.
There we go. Sorry.
Perfect.
Thank you, Felice. Thanks to a fantastic panel. Thank you, Consul General Harper, Matt, and everybody. This is a critically important topic, not just for the industry, but for our communities. The Florida Venture Forum has been engaged in formed a task force a few years ago to focus on diversity and inclusion, probably many years too late, but Don't have time to go into all of the things that we've put in place, but I will report that we have a conference coming up in October, our annual early stage capital conference, and 6 of the 22 selected companies are woman or minority founded, and that's a record for our organization. 6 of 22 is not enough, of course. We can do better, but we are doing some things right, and we're going to build on those things, and we're just really grateful to be a participant in the community and in this great discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And thank you again to Michelle, to Matthew, and the Consul General and our distinguished panel. We definitely have unpacked a lot within the last hour, but this is truly just the tip of the iceberg. And we hope and encourage everyone to keep the conversation going online and offline, and to make sure that we put these recommendations into action. In closing, I also want to reiterate my deep appreciation to our panelists, and also just some of the key takeaways that I heard. Starting one, and there were many, so this is by no means to summarize or simplify all that we discussed, but I think at the top, the more diverse an investment firm and an ecosystem for that matter, the higher its performance. And don't just take our word for it. Look at the data. Back to Susan and Sophie's point. And then diversity actually accelerates innovation. It attracts top talent. It helps identify new markets, and it reduces turnover and improves brand reputation, all of which creates shareholder and stakeholder value. Creating a more inclusive workplace is a cultural shift that starts at the top, but is not exclusively just about the top. Back to Leanne's point, it's also ground up. Leaders need to convene and articulate shared goals and collaborative activities to truly foster a culture of inclusion. And last but not least, firms and organizations need to look at the metrics beyond just representation. It's not about tokenism, as Susan pointed out. Mentorship, professional development opportunities, breaking down barriers, promoting access. These are the ways we create on-ramps of opportunities. If you'd like to learn more about our panelists and their work in the Zoom chat, and I've seen a bunch of folks already connecting, and Susan, very quick to respond and connect with them as well. There's direct links to their LinkedIn profiles. I encourage you to reach out and to connect. And if you've enjoyed today's discussion, I encourage you to join us at Emerge Americas for our upcoming virtual events such as this one, and also our annual event this upcoming April 2021 at the Miami Beach Convention Center. To find out more details about our programming and our dynamic content and lineup, as well as the latest news and trends in tech and venture, please subscribe to our newsletter, The Brief, at emergeamericas.com. Thank you again for joining us this afternoon, and I look forward to reconnecting with everyone soon. Take care, everybody.
Felice, I think we're supposed to have time for a couple of questions in the timing. So I don't know if you wanted to jump into the Q&A portion and see if we have time to answer them. I think we have a couple minutes left.
Oh, absolutely. In the chat, I know that we were taking up some of them as they were coming, so I'm not sure if there's anybody else who has any questions that they want to add.
So Felice, we have 2 questions, really engaging questions that have been submitted in the Q&A. If you'd like, I can read them. The first one is from Mr. Rahman. His first question is, retaining talent in the US or Canada revolves around buy-in from the corporate world with the local workforce development programs like FIU UpLabs that are creating middle-skilled workforce that are essential for scaling. How do we get the buy-in from local corporations to keep local talent?
Anybody want to take that one?
Susan, are you gonna jump in here?
I can bobble together an answer. So I think one of the challenges with being as VC ready as possible is not the bottom level of the little Indians who help get a business going. I think where we're really seeing the challenges in many communities, including South Florida, is the mid-level and upper level executives who have experience in global scale, in making sure technology can scale, not just putting something together and getting stuff done. And so I think that there are a lot of really awesome capacity building programs for getting the base talent together to be able to have entry-level jobs that are well-paying, technical, etc. But where we're really seeing the disconnect between VCs being like, yes, stay in South Florida, you're going to find the people you need and you're going to be able to scale and become a global company here. We're still having that disconnect with the pedigreed, and not by school, I mean experienced talent that knows how to build a global company. And I think Kevin might be able to answer, and Leanne to be able to talk about that from this perspective. There are so many great initiatives in South Florida for capacity building, and we love them, WinCode and all of these great things, stuff happening at the universities. We need to figure out the executive side of that person's going to help us, become, the $100 million revenue a year company. And we need more of those.
Just to supplement what Susan said, you're exactly right. There is a mid-skill gap. And that is not something we prioritize because it's a long-term strategy that you've got to invest better to make sure that people get the experiences, that we're scaling up the companies where people get these large firm training. I'm a lawyer by trade. The reason why I know how to do what I do is because I worked at a large firm and got big company training that was paid for by the clients for me to learn how to try a case, for example. And so when you take that same strategy and apply it to the tech, innovation, and entrepreneurial space, specifically when you're looking at high-tech scale-ups, things like Miami Angels Talent Scout help to address gaps that exist in the supply demand. So I think there's folks here, there's not a lot of them. So certainly we don't have an overabundance of those mid-scale executive talent, but there's a lot of people moving in that may not be as connected. So Talent Scout will take the talent, for example, that has had experience at a global company and make them available through a small curated newsletter just to say, this person's in town, this person is here. You may not know them because they're not, in the main circles or not talking, in the Herald articles. So they're kind of flying below the radar. The other opportunity that I think that COVID has helped to eliminate is this opportunity for remote work, right? Yep. A lot of us have been talking about the Silicon Valley tech companies have positions that they need more inclusive engineers. They need more opportunities to hire folks, and they're now more willing to entertain remote work opportunities. So it's a really interesting time for us to be able to get some top engineering and back-end developers working at those large companies so that when they leave, eventually they're going to leave, they'll be able to help build up the ecosystem here. So it's a supply-demand connectivity issue, and it's a real remote work opportunity.
I think in a Canadian context, we're talking about, there are a lot of similarities, but there are some very important distinctions. When we think about the brain drain in Canada, we're thinking about it typically from Canada towards the United States. Certainly Silicon Valley, of course, in the tech sector. And so I think the concentrated effort to combat the brain drain, if I can sort of frame it that way, may look a little bit different. There were probably various different players. I think the Canadian from a political landscape plays a much bigger role. We'll look at things like tax incentives to keep the R&D efforts up in Canada. We'll be looking at funneling public money into things like ecosystem building, whether that be through university hubs, whether that be through accelerators. Very often there is a salary competition issue that I think large tech companies are facing in Canada versus the United States. But it's part of the role of venture capital and Canadian venture capital fund managers that are investing within the Canadian ecosystem. I go back to what I said, I think a little earlier, with capital means influence. And we have a responsibility as Canadian VCs to help shape or positively influence the Canadian society that we want to live in and we want to invest in. And so it's a bit nuanced, I think, if I'm talking about putting on my Canadian hat and looking at it through that lens. But certainly I would, just in addition to everything that Susan and Leanne mentioned applies.
If I could build on Sophie's point, I actually think it's very well made. Obviously, I run a company, and we're in the diversity and inclusion space, but we're also a startup. So we're in the ecosystem on the other side of things. So connected to founders who are raising, and this might be a bit of a controversial opinion, but I don't know how controversial this is. That Canadian VCs are much more they have a greater risk aversion than American VCs. And this translates in a number of different ways across a number of different funds, but generally it is a pattern that is kind of acknowledged in the community, and something that I think VCs are starting to think more about is how does that translate into investments that are being made into underrepresented founders? Because typically, what are those factors that lead VCs to think that the risk is lower in investing in someone? Well, it's someone that has raised money already. It's someone that has done or started a company before and successfully exited in whatever way. It's someone that maybe has those networks and knows the people that they who can vouch for that specific individual. And I think as a result, all of those factors contribute to Leanne's point and Susan's point earlier that underrepresented founders might not have those things. They might not have that experience, or they might not have that those networks, or haven't raised money previously, or what have you. So I think that mindset shift is important as well, to start looking at, even if you want to keep your talent here domestically, just maybe adjusting your risk or perceived risk scale a little bit and saying, well, listen, like these are some of the adjustments that we'll have to make if we want to make sure that our founders are staying here and frankly, like succeeding.
Great points. Ash, do we have any other questions?
Yes, we do. We have two last remaining questions that we can close out. The first one is from an anonymous attendee. And the question is, we're talking about creating a battle plan for diversity and inclusion and actioning it. Can you point to operations or groups that have done so, or some case studies? I know that we've mentioned that before, but if there's any operations or groups that you ladies can reference for our attendees, that would be excellent.
I can jump in with case studies. So definitely, and Sophie mentioned them before, from a VC, and I'm not sure if this individual is from an investor, or they're a VC, or they're just another organization or another business. But from the investor side, if you look up diversity VC online, you'll see a list of VCs. These are the VCs that we're working with that are actioning on diversity, inclusion, strategy, and plan. This is like the three-pronged strategy that I mentioned before. So these VCs include Frontline, they include Ada Ventures, they include Balderton, Omer's Ventures, like I mentioned, BDC, Bessemer, etc. So they're the ones that are kind of tactically looking at this and developing a strategy and a plan and then executing it. I think no matter, honestly, where you go, the data is the number one. It's the most critical piece to start off with. Collect the data, whether it's within your fund or across your employees, or within your organization. And then after you have that data, start developing a strategy and start creating your battle plan. We work with companies before that have kind of tried to do a strategy before collecting the data, and oftentimes it's not as effective because you're not necessarily solving for the problem that you have. You might see the outcome, and the outcome might be that your people of color or folks from a minority background are leaving, and you have a sense why, and then you implement a strategy, or you develop a strategy around that gut kind of instinct. But then once you collect the data, you find out that it's for a completely different reason. And so I think setting that baseline at your core is the most important, which is kind of what we're trying to do with funds.
I would also add, I think Anya is exactly on point, that you need to benchmark with an assessment so you can understand where there are gaps and things that perhaps you would have overlooked that the technology, algorithms, and the process is able to surface, but also beginning, at least from the VC side, to look at what are some core elements of an actionable strategy that's not a check the box, which I think is really, really important, that the problem is a cultural problem. And so when you're looking at cultural problems, you have to identify strategies and tactics that shift mindset. And so I'm a personal believer that that it is experiences, immersive experiences that allow for you to connect emotionally to the root of the problem that help to shift mindset more so than a report. And sorry, like people are texting me. And so things like trust. How do you create trust? Creating trust with a diverse network requires that you begin to think beyond co-investing and having regular relationships with those feeder funds or funds that you can be partnering with. Here in the States, you know, Marlon Nichols, Monique Woodard at Cake Ventures, Black Angels Miami right here, Precursor Ventures. There's a lot of groups that if funds are not connected to them, they be because they have the pipeline, the relationship, and the existing trust with founders of color that a fund may not have access to. The second thing is beginning to think about those culture shifts that happen with understanding that that's an ROI question. Don't think about investing in diverse founders as a handout. You're leaving money on the table. I don't have the stats for Canada, but at least in the United States, the minority market is I think it's like a $2.4 trillion market. $2.4 trillion of buying power. So if you're not investing in solutions that are serving a $2.4 trillion market, you're not thinking about ROI and you're not actually doing your job as an investor. And so beginning to understand those mindset shifts, that it's not a handout, that you have to look at shifting your culture, that you have to diversify those trusted partners, and then begin to think about not just giving checks, but understanding that the relational capital pieces, those connections and networks are why founders actually go with ventures. It's not just a check size. It is, can you help me scale? Can you open me up to opportunities? Can you unlock contracts? And so beginning to look at how you do more than just throw a check in because you're trying to diversify your portfolio is an important piece of the D&I battle plan, in my opinion.
Absolutely. And Leanne, you're talking about the immersive experiences. You had and led a program called Capital Days, which did just that. Maybe you can expand a little bit on it.
Sure. So the idea behind Capital Days was not to look at the stats, but to look at what are the underlying causes of the lack of inclusion and deployment of capital, one of which was trust plus access, right? It's not that we know the 1%, the 0.006%, we know the stats, but how do we create experiences that build trust? And then how do we create access to founders so people can't, unfortunately, say, like, I think it was the CEO of Wells Fargo was, I can't find Black executives to hire. Put that on Twitter this past week. Like that is a mindset we're trying to shift. Kevin, you were really instrumental in being involved, Felice and the team at Emerge. And one of the things that we did is we began to have conversations around what are the real experiences of founders and what are the real challenges that that investors are having in small, closed door, off the record environments so that people felt safe. And then the other thing we did is we had something called Dinner Deconstructed. And I know it seems silly, but we randomly sent people to homes throughout Miami and had a private catered dinner in the home. And I'll send Ashley the link to that video. Those dinners were able to result in real investment opportunities, real relationships between investors and founders that they didn't otherwise have exposure to. I was sitting at my table with collectively people that had raised or exited companies that were over $1 billion at my dinner table. That's crazy. But that's when you intentionally think about how humans connect. We're hardwired for connection. We're not hardwired to review reports. And so I think you need to couple the data with the human experience, and that's how you begin to unlock some of those cultural deficiencies that result in what we see as the inequities.
Amen, amen.
Our last and final question is from Jared Mueller, and it's actually a question posed for Sophie. He says, for incubators like ours at Mayo Clinic that are already in touch with the Canadian technology accelerators, is there a CVCA contact we should reach out to about supporting other diverse Canadian founders who might not be a part of a CTA program? Thank you.
Absolutely. And I may very well be that person to start with. I think that's part of the work the Diversity and Inclusion Committee is we have on our website, one of our 6 streams of work is to provide a resource library. So similar to sort of diversity.vc, which is a great resource as well. I know that Anya mentioned, and you should certainly check that out. That's got a little bit more of an international lens. At CBCA, we're certainly looking within a Canadian perspective, but we will have listed organizations where you may find access to more of an expansive deal flow. There are a few of other tools that are kind of being developed as well. I recently learned of Crunchbase. So Crunchbase is probably you're familiar with, as well as PitchBook, excuse me, I was drawing a blank. But Crunchbase has recently rolled out a program that they call their Diversity Spotlight. And basically what that enables you to do is kind of view and search using diversity filters. So you could search with race and ethnicity as an example. So looking for, show me the organizations that are seeking capital or that have recently raised capital that are doing X, Y, Z, as you normally would conduct a Crunchbase search. But by Black-led or Black founder or women-led, women founder, whatever it is your lens that you're looking for is. So there are a couple of tools like that. Otherwise, please do absolutely reach out to me, and we can connect through the other member group of the event committee.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sophie. And thank you, everyone. I think now we are out of time, but I also want to thank Leanne for signaling that we did have more time, because I think this was an important part of the conversation. And so I'm grateful for that. And I just want to once again share our deep appreciation with the Consulate of Canada, with all our panelists, Susan, Sophie, Leanne, Anya, Kevin. Thank you for your partnership, and of course our team at Emerge, but especially Ashley Abdullah, who you saw here at the tail end, but was a driving force of today's conversation, and an incredible part of our leadership team at Emerge, and very grateful for your leadership. With that said, everyone, thank you so much, and we'll reconnect again soon. Take care, everyone.